Our speaker is Jessica Lowe Miner, President of the League of Women Voters of Florida. Jessica is a passionate voter rights advocate who served 3 terms on the board of the League of Women Voters of the United States, most recently as LWV U.S. Vice President from 2020 to 2022. She is the principal and co-founder of a nonprofit consulting firm called Capacity Works, and she has extensive nonprofit sector experience, having served in strategic, policy, and management roles. She was the executive director of the Institute of Nonprofit Innovation and Excellence in Tallahassee, Florida, from 2015 to 2018. From 2010 to 2014, she served as the executive director for the League of Women Voters of Florida. Jessica has a master's degree in women's and gender studies from the program in interdisciplinary humanities at Florida State University and has taught at both FSU and Tallahassee State College. She's also a licensed realtor, the mother of 2 young daughters, and she enjoys hiking, horseback riding, and listening to podcasts. Welcome, Jessica.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here with everyone tonight. Do you want me to just take over?
Please do. Please do.
All right. Well, I think given the familiarity that this group most likely has with redistricting, I do have a formal presentation, but I'm going to try to kind of whiz through that a little bit so that we can get to, some more meaty group discussion and questions. And I always feel like league members ask the best questions, so I want to make sure that we leave time for that. So let me see if I can share my screen. I'm gonna, do have a formal presentation. So once I have screen sharing permission, I'll pull that up and we can go from there. All right. Okay. So I want to go ahead and start kind of mid-presentation actually, because this is an overview of redistricting in general, but I want to zip to kind of the Florida specific, the Florida specific landscape. So let me come from slideshow. Current slide. Okay, so is everyone looking, and I see a few of you, so if you could just nod, is everybody looking at something that has Florida redistricting and agenda at the top? Okay, yes. Perfect. So kind of the quick background that would have been covered if we had been doing the whole kind of 45-minute, hour-long presentation, is that redistricting is something that is, legally mandated, that it must happen after a census is done. Historically, census counts have been done every 10 years in the United States. It's actually in the Constitution that they will be done at least every 10 years. And they've been done kind of on the 10-year, like the first every year ending in a 0. So like 1990, 2000, 2010, 2020. So the most recent census that was done was in 2020. And it takes a really long time. Census operations are massive. Many of you have probably volunteered to help with the census, but they're very complicated. It takes a long time to make sure that every American is counted and that there are no households that are missing or left out of the census. The last census, when it was done in 2020 during the first Trump administration, and Governor DeSantis was in the Florida governor's mansion at that time. Okay, so a little bit of a background about Florida's redistricting law. So Florida is actually very unique in that we have some special provisions that were placed into our state constitution about redistricting. Redistricting, and I should even back up a little more. Redistricting is the process of drawing the political lines. It's something that is done by the Florida legislature. Every legislature across the country has their own process for redistricting. And some states do have independent commissions that do the redistricting. Most states are like us in that legislators are responsible for redistricting. And at the time that they redistrict, they're drawing the congressional lines. They're also drawing, the state house and state Senate lines. They obviously don't draw the gubernatorial lines or anything that's a state level office because the lines for those are the existing state boundaries. So like the US Senate, it's very clear what the district is going to be. It's going to be the entire state of Florida. The governor, has the entire state of Florida, but anything that is a smaller part of the state. So a congressional seat is like a carve out of, we have 27 in Florida. Anything that is a carve out of the state that requires kind of some circumcision, I would say, in terms of our circumspection. Whoops, we don't want to get into that, but circumspection, then that would be something that would be within the legislature's domain. So, but in 2010, the League of Women Voters and other groups really thought that the legislature was not doing a good job in terms of drawing the lines appropriately. And we were involved in the effort to pass amendments 5 and 6. And so we'll talk a little bit about those because they're now once again in the forefront of people's conversation. Okay, so gerrymandering is something that is a process to kind of draw the lines to favor specific political parties or incumbents. And so it was first done kind of in the 1800s in Massachusetts. There was this, I guess a congressional or not a congressional, but a state legislator who drew lines and someone said, oh, well, that looks, and his last name was Jerry. And someone said that one of the districts that he drew looked like a salamander. And so there was a political cartoon with that district calling it a gerrymander. And so that's how we get the name gerrymandering. And it is after this state senator from Massachusetts, whose first name escapes me, but his last name was Jerry. And his district that, among the many districts that he drew, one looked like a salamander. So since the 1800s, legislators have been kind of engaged in this sneaky way of trying to, really rig the system and draw districts that benefit themselves. Both parties have done it, right? So the Democrats have done it, the Republicans have done it. It is not good for voters, but it is something that both parties have kind of been the perpetrators of. In Florida in particular, for many, many decades, it was the Democrats who were gerrymandering the state to maintain control. Then when the Republicans got in, they also were doing it. So it's not something where, one party is innocent of all charges by any means. But essentially voters got very frustrated, particularly here in Florida, with the fact that, our legislature was playing politics with the districts, and it creates a situation where voters don't really have an ability to hold their elected officials accountable because you have districts that are, essentially drawn in such a way where one party is going to come out victorious whether or not voters are happy with their performance. And so that's a major problem from a governing perspective. So we worked with many other organizations to pass amendments 5 and 6 in 2010. When they were passed, 63% of the electorate approved them. And so these were passed, I believe, prior to the requirement that 60% plus one of voters approve something. I think that came a little bit after 2010, but we still would have met that threshold. And so amendments 5 and 6 were, resoundingly approved. And they created new standards on redistricting. And so here are the standards. District lines cannot be drawn to favor one political party over another. They cannot be drawn to harm the voting power of racial or language minorities, and districts have to be contiguous. They also, well, we are very unhappy with the Florida legislature because they have persistently not wanted to follow these rules. So they have, in many instances, tried to thwart these rules. The League of Women Voters and others have sued the state of Florida. Actually, we sued them back in the kind of 2012 cycle when they redistricted for the first time after Fair Districts was passed. We have sued them after the 2020 cycle, the 2022 cycle that the most recent redistricting cycle. So we have kind of consistently not been pleased with the way that the Florida legislature has implemented, or really, to our minds, failed to implement these standards. Here's an example. So in 2012, the legislature had this district here, Congressional District 5. It looks very swirly, kind of crazy district. That was drawn as a minority access district, which actually redistricting standards in our state constitution do protect the rights of racial minority communities and language minority communities to have districts that they can elect candidates of their choice. We felt, though, that they didn't have to draw it in the way that you see above in order to achieve that goal. And so here you can see the map on the bottom that was approved in 2015. And so that's actually a map that was, suggested by the League of Women Voters of Florida during litigation. Ultimately, the courts adopted that map and forced the legislature to adopt this map. But that District 5 that you see across, that is a district that was drawn to be a minority access district. It goes across the north of the state, across what is known as sometimes Florida's Black Belt. And so there is a large number of African American voters that live kind of in that part of the state from central Duval County, Jacksonville, all the way across parts of Tallahassee and into Gadsden County, which is, I believe, the only majority minority county in the state of Florida. So it is, an important area in terms of ensuring that Black voters have the ability to elect a candidate that will represent their concerns. This district in particular, this District 15, is a district that was eliminated by the Florida legislature in 2022. And so let me see if we have, yeah, here we go. So you can see the 2015 map is the one that we just talked about. You can see in 2022, the map that was put into place does not include that minority access district. And part of both the Voting Rights Act and the original Fair District standards is that, you cannot intentionally diminish the power of a racial minority group to elect candidates of their choice. And so by eliminating this District 5 that we knew was a minority access district and essentially just, breaking it up in a way that it was going to be near impossible for Black voters to be able to control the outcome of that election or of multiple elections, that really did undermine representation for minority voters in North Florida. And what's happening now is there's actually a US Supreme Court case that would potentially eliminate. So the Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act relates to redistricting, and it prohibits states from doing essentially what the state of Florida did in 2025 or in 2022 when it drew the bottom map. Is it says that states cannot, where there are communities that are in a reasonable proximity to each other, that you could draw a district to protect minority voters. And it has like a whole test of like how to determine whether or not a district is protected by the Voting Rights Act or not. But essentially, if you have communities that are, adjacent to each other that meet certain criteria under the Voting Rights Act, you have to do what you can to protect that population and like enable them to have a district so that they can elect a candidate who's going to be concerned about the things that that population is concerned with. Um, so right now, literally right now, the Supreme Court is considering a case that people do believe might eliminate that requirement, that essentially the types of minority access districts that section, that the top map has, that section, the District 5 across the state, that would be completely eliminated, and that basically legislators would not be able to create quote race conscious districts. And we can talk about that a little bit more in the Q&A, but that is something that we're very aware of. Now, when we sued the state of Florida over the change from the top map to the bottom map, that 2022 change, basically our state Supreme Court said that the race conscious kind of approach that was required by our state constitutional amendment, the Fair Districts Amendment, that was counterindicated by the US Constitution and the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. And so that's always been a tension between the Voting Rights Act and the 14th Amendment. And in the past, courts have been more kind of willing to accept the race conscious mandate that the Voting Rights Act put forward. But obviously now we're in a different era. And so courts are having different interpretations. So we'll talk about that a little bit more. But bottom line is our state Supreme Court did not agree with us about the need to protect the minority access district in North Florida. And they did uphold the bottom map. And so the bottom map, which eliminated that district, is currently the map that's in place. And so, here we are kind of all guns blazing, trying to say, please do not redistrict, right? But we're still not really happy with the current map. So it's not that we're trying to defend the current map when we say don't redistrict. But what we are saying is that there should be a fair and transparent process for doing redistricting, and that you shouldn't be able to do redistricting kind of in an arbitrary and very obviously partisan way. And so that's what's happening at this moment. Some people have asked us, like, oh, well, you're saying not to redistrict. Does that mean that you like the current map? And the answer is no, we don't. We hate the current map, but we don't like the process that's being used now. Okay, so what is happening now? Like, what's the current threat? So in July of 2025, again, this map had been upheld in court. The court also did not say that the legislature had to do a new map drawing, right? So what the court said was that the existing map that the state had created in 2022, that map was found to be consistent with our state and our federal constitutions, and that it could stand. But it did not say, oh, well, you have to do a new one. It said this map is constitutional, and we thought that would be the end of the story. Well, so pretty quickly after that, the governor started talking about how Florida had been ripped off in the census count, that basically Florida had been undercounted, that there were more citizens in Florida than had been counted or had been accounted for by the 2020 census. And that because of that, Florida deserved an extra congressional seat, that basically our population was sufficient to warrant an additional seat, but that, the census had been inaccurately done, and therefore there should be a new census. Or if there wasn't a new census, there should somehow still Florida should get a new seat. Well, like in order for Florida to get a new seat, it has to come from somewhere else. And so without a new census, you can't justify just like taking some other state's congressional seat. So there was kind of a flurry of like conversation for a little while that perhaps there would be a new census, but there's never been a census that was done in between the regular 10-year census. So like the 10-year census takes 10 years to prepare for. So like the idea of doing a pop census or a surprise census is not, nobody who knew anything about doing the census thought that that was viable. But for a little while, there was some buzz about perhaps a new census could be done. But no, now that has pretty much been put to bed. I haven't heard that rumor for several months. But during this time, about the conversation about how Florida needed a new congressional seat and yada yada, there was a call that was made from the White House to Governor Abbott in Texas, in which President Trump straight up asked, as far as we know, this has been widely reported, asked Governor Abbott to redistrict the state of Texas in order to find additional Republican seats coming to the US Congress from Texas. And there was you might have watched the news. There was, Democrats fleeing the state in order to prevent the legislature in Texas from having a quorum necessary for a vote. I mean, all these kind of shenanigans. But what ultimately happened is that Texas did adopt a new map that is very clearly and very intentionally and very openly gerrymandered on a partisan basis, right? Well, so in Texas, they do not have what we have, which is state constitutional language saying you can't draw districts to favor or disfavor a political party or incumbent. So there's been a lot of stuff about, oh, well, what's going to happen if the Voting Rights Act falls? What's going to happen if we have, our state protection of minority access districts, if that essentially is found to be inconsistent with the US Constitution because of the 14th Amendment, what happens? Well, I personally think that minority access districts are important, and I support the ability of minority communities to elect candidates of their choice. Like that is a personal value that I hold. And our state constitution prohibits partisan gerrymandering as well. So, even if they try to say, oh, well, we're doing this in order to fix the race conscious gerrymandering. Well, I think it's pretty obvious that the main reason that this is happening and that this whole exercise is going on is for partisan control of Congress. I mean, the other thing that's a real tell is that they're only talking about redistricting Congress. They're not talking about redistricting the state house or the state legislature. So like if this was something where it was about the principle of the matter, then maybe we would be talking about a mid-cycle redistricting for all three chambers, but they're really only talking about Congress because this is a national power play designed, basically at the president's behest, to try to secure, or I guess entrench, current control of Congress, even if voters are unhappy with the current congressional performance, right? And we know that congressional approval is incredibly low right now. So voters in a fair system, if voters are unhappy with congressional performance, in theory, we would see a lot of change after the election, right? But folks are trying to rig the system so that that doesn't happen. Okay, so going back to our timeline here. Governor DeSantis started talking about this in July. In August, there was quite, the flurry of activity in Texas. When Texas announced its plan, then California announced its counter plan, right? And there've just been kind of this domino effect of states saying, well, if one state's going to do it, then we're going to do it. And, again, both the Democrats and the Republicans have been perpetrators of this. Like everybody is trying to rig the maps to gain control instead of having fair maps and letting voters have the control. That is how democracy works. And so this really is a thwarting of all the fair rules of play that we have in our democracy. State House Speaker Daniel Perez has appointed a select committee to consider drawing new congressional districts. That select committee was announced on September 8th, but there have been no public hearings yet, and there have been no draft maps released to the public. And so we can kind of speculate, maybe in Q&A, why that is. These are the members who were appointed to the special committee on congressional redistricting. So Mike Redondo is the chair, Jessica Baker, Kim Burfield, Nan Cobb, Peggy Gossett-Seidman, Pat Maney, Jenna Persons Malika, Will Robinson are the Republicans on the committee, and Bruce Antone, Kevin Chambliss, and Joanna Lopez are the Democrats on the committee. So this committee has been named, but to our knowledge, they have not met. There have been, they should not be meeting in secret. And so we are kind of waiting to see when and if this committee is going to hold any hearings and what will be the outcome. All right, so what is our position? I think I've been making our position clear throughout this presentation, but essentially we think that elected officials should not have the power to pick their constituents. The constituents have the power to pick their elected officials. That is what democracy looks like. And so we are advocating against mid-cycle redistricting. So we do support independent commissions. There has been quite a bit of, I guess, speculation about a future ballot measure campaign related to creating an independent commission to actually implement the fair district standards that are already in our Constitution, because the legislature has repeatedly shown that it's not willing to be a good steward of those standards. And so it might be time to create a new body to actually implement those. We support minority representation. We support community integrity. We support transparency and public input. It's like a real problem that all of these things are happening behind the scenes, and that the public is not being invited to hearings to talk about how this would impact them, to talk about whether or not they want this to happen. Like the public is the pawn in all this, and that is, again, the exact opposite of what should be happening. And we also reject districts being drawn for political motives. And it's very clear that that is what's at play here. Nobody was talking about doing this at all until the phone call to Texas. Okay. We believe that the legislature should not ignore the will of the people. Obviously, 63% of voters chose to place fair districts into the Constitution in 2010. And there's some more recent polling. So in September of 2025, so just this past month and a half ago, Common Cause polled Florida residents. They had a polling firm do it. But what they found is that 55% of Floridians rejected the concept of mid-decade redistricting in Florida. 76% support an independent commission made up of citizens, not lawmakers, to draw district lines. And 66% support banning mid-decade redistricting. So they actually want Congress to ban mid-decade redistricting. That same majority supports Congress banning maps that favor one political party. So it's pretty clear that Florida voters believe that redistricting is something that should be done on a nonpartisan basis by, obviously, an independent commission. Okay, so where are we at? We are watching and waiting. In the meantime, we are trying to be as proactive about reaching out to members of our legislative delegations as possible, to tell them to reject flat out mid-decade redistricting. Again, we don't love the current map. It's not like we, in a perfect world, if they were gonna redistrict, they would create a better map than they currently have. Um, but we don't think that that's a real likely outcome. And the precedent of, okay, if they're going to do a mid-decade redistricting, well, what's to stop them from doing a redistricting literally every 2 years? What's to stop them from saying, oh, well, hey, this person really caused some problems for us passing, this bill this year. So why don't we just redraw their district so that they can't win re-election and then the problem's solved, right? So it becomes a very bitter, super political opportunity to eliminate, you know, a political adversary. And it's not good for voters. I mean, at the end of the day, if there's no transparency, if you don't know from one cycle to another what your district is going to look like, candidates who are potentially, seeking to run for office can't communicate with voters if they don't know who those voters are going to be. It makes it hard for people who are not incumbents. It could also make it hard for incumbents if they are on the outs with leadership. um, the whole thing is really problematic. So we are trying to just urge legislators to not support any mid-decade redistricting. The current maps will stay the maps until a new census is done in 2030, and there will be a new map developed in 2032. That would be the timeline that we would be on without kind of this roller coaster leaving the station. We are aware that there could potentially be special legislative sessions called. There is not really an opportunity for a new seat in the US House. Like, that is not going to happen right now because there has not been a new census done. We hope that everyone will watch. And as we're sending out action alerts, and please be tuned to your email. And we also will talk in the Q&A about things that you guys can do as members on this issue. It's a little technical, but don't forget that it's pretty clear that most Floridians have at least a clear enough base understanding to think, hey, this is pretty fishy. And so when you're talking to people, you don't have to get too in the weeds. You just have to let people know that this is, politicians rigging the system to suit themselves. And it's something that Floridians should not support. And people are like, yeah, that's bad. So we can be really effective messengers on this because we do understand how technical it is, but we can also keep it, at a level that most voters kind of intuitively understand. All right. Some other things to mention when you're talking to people. Redistricting is not free. It is actually very expensive, particularly for taxpayers. So as part of its redistricting efforts in the past, the state legislature has spent millions of dollars on consultants, GIS experts, advocates. They've also had to pay for a lot of litigation because they are not following the standards. And so then they get sued and then they have to defend these maps in court. Certainly any map that they draw under these circumstances right now will face litigation because, again, we have something in our constitution that says that you can't draw maps to favor or disfavor a political party or incumbent, which, if they're redistricting right now, then that is the only reason for them to be doing it, is for partisan reasons. And so, of course, we will take that to court. And taxpayers foot the bill for all of that. And, most Floridians want the legislature to be focusing on things related to economic issues, related to affordability, related to education, related to housing. There's some major, you guys are in, kind of North or Southwest Florida, like there's major environmental things that people are concerned about. And, redrawing the maps for politicians is not what Floridians want the legislature to be spending time and money on. Okay. These are essentially some kind of talking points around why, like, our values about redistricting. We think that everyone should be counted equally, obviously. We should be playing by the rules. The process should be transparent and fair. Public views and public input should be taken into consideration. Redistricting should not cause voter confusion. It should not silence communities, and it should not reduce the power of the people. And again, at the end of the day, voters should choose their politicians, not the other way around. And we need to remind people, especially our legislature, that voters do not want this and that they are watching. So, with that being said, we'll talk more about what you can do. We're urging everyone to write letters and to call their state rep and their state senator. Your congressional rep, like congressional folks might play a role, like we'll talk about that. But for now, we really want folks to focus on their state representative and their state senator, because those are the people who would be voting on a redistricting plan if one was in fact put forward. If you haven't already had your legislative delegation meeting, I think you guys have. That's an opportunity to talk to your full legislative delegation, and just let people in your network know what's going on, explain it, and stay engaged. Okay, we're to questions. So I'm going to stop sharing, and I will happily open it up to comments from everyone. And hopefully that was clear and not too technical, because again, it is a little weedsy, especially the stuff about the Voting Rights Act, kind of the 14th Amendment, this Supreme Court case that's going on, Louisiana versus Calais, which is like a Louisiana case, but it does have implications for all of us who support, voting rights and fair districts.
So
Thank you, Jessica. So first of all, I'll tell you that our legislative delegation meeting is next Thursday, a week from today, and we have requested time to speak to them on that.
Perfect, just in time.
Secondly, I wanted to refer back, you said that this would be a good question. So why have they not? Why has there been no action other than setting the select committee?
Okay, so the gossip on the street is, I guess there's what I hope is going on, and then there's the gossip on the street. So what I hope is happening is that legislators are hearing from their constituents, and I know that they are, like, because our members are calling, people across the state don't like this. We just saw the polling results, right? People don't like this. What I hope is happening is that people are hearing from their constituents at these legislative delegation meetings, they're getting phone calls, postcards, emails into their office, and they're like, ooh, we might not want to do this. This feels like a third rail kind of issue. We probably, should press pause. That's what I hope is happening. The behind the scenes rumors is that current congressional Republicans, to be frank, like their districts the way that they are. And so whenever you redistrict, you are, slicing a little bit out here and putting it into an adjacent district and yada yada. And if you like your current district and you think that your chances of reelection in your current district are very good, then you don't want your district to be reconfigured in such a way that might make your district more competitive. I mean, to be frank, right? So it might be good ultimately if some of those districts became more competitive for voters to be able to express, their wishes. But if you are the incumbent congressperson, that might be something that you don't think is a good idea. And so we are hearing kind of behind the scenes that it's pressure from the existing Republican delegation that they do not want this to happen, and that there's also kind of a school of thought that our current state congressional delegate, or our current state congressional map is already very gerrymandered. Again, this is a map that we sued over, but it was upheld by the court. And that there really isn't like a way, because no matter how you draw the districts, there still are going to be Democratic voters in Florida, Republican voters in Florida, right? So like no matter how you draw the districts, you can't erase those voters. They're still here, right? So some people speculate that you know, this whole like exercise is almost futile because the current map is already as gerrymandered as possible, and that if you try to gerrymander it anymore, you risk what's called a dummy mander, which is a, you know, it's called a dummy because the party that does it ends up basically shooting themselves in the foot. That they are going for broke, and in so doing, they take a seat that was like kind of a very, very either deep, dark red or dark blue seat, and they end up creating two seats that are light red or light blue. And then now maybe one or both of those seats flips. And so then they, you know, were by going for broke, they ended up inadvertently creating districts that were slightly more competitive. So, you know, the gossip is that basically it's been reviewed and the risk of a dummy mander was found to be too high, or that it's been kind of that there's been a lot of pressure from the existing congressional delegation not to do it because they're pretty happy with their current seats. So either of those reasons would be totally partisan reasons, right? So we would not be happy with those as rationale for decision making. But that being said, like those are rumors that we're hearing. So we hope that people do not do it because it's the right thing. But we're also aware. Yeah, we have ears.
Okay.
Yeah.
We have a question in the chat from Holly. What is the deadline that this would need to be in place to be ready for the 2026 midterms? So
Yeah,
can they
yep.
do it in this session and then implement it for the 26th?
Yes, so it has to be finalized by the closing deadline, which is the period for federal candidates to file. And so that deadline is in April. I believe it's like April 20th through the 26th is like the week when candidates for federal office, they have to file during that window. And so I don't know if the deadline is when that window opens or when that window closes, but it is essentially in like kind of mid to late April would be really, if it doesn't happen by then, it cannot happen because at that point, people have filed to run for a district that now doesn't exist or has been changed significantly. So my understanding is that really April, you know, we have to be very vigilant between now and that April window.
Well, I think session ends like March 13th or something, doesn't it? So,
Yes,
yeah.
and so in
Okay.
theory, they could, you know, pass something during session. They have not called a special session. We thought maybe, you know, early when they were talking about this in August, we were kind of like ready for them to call a special session. They have not called a special session. That doesn't mean that they still can't. We have heard that they're unlikely to call a special session between now and the regular session. But in theory, they could do this as part of the regular session, or they could hold a special session immediately after the regular session ends. So, you know, we're not out of the danger zone by any means.
Right. Okay. Other questions? You can raise your hand or type something in the chat. Anybody else? Okay, while we'll wait, I'll just tell you, I did receive a notification the last few days that there is petition language filed with the Division of Elections for an independent citizen redistricting. They're going through the process right now, so they haven't filed the official petition, but there is something in the works, as you mentioned, so.
Well, that's something that we've supported, you know, the league has supported for a long time. So I would love
Right.
to see that. You know, I'll have to look to
I'll
read.
forward you the
Yeah.
information, so.
Thank
Mary
you.
Pat.
Thanks. So I want to go back to the beginning of what you were talking about, and you said that Governor DeSantis said that there were inaccuracies in the census in 2020 and that we should actually have another seat. Does he have any evidence of that? Or is this just one of those misinformation campaigns?
Yeah, I mean, there are, so the census is the most, comprehensive, population count that we have. However, there are other ways to track population. There's the American Community Survey. You know, there's other things that are done in between the census, that, you know, you can kind of see like population trends. Um, you know, what's interesting about his kind of protests about the inaccuracy of the census is that in the lead up to the census, um, there were community groups, including, I believe, the league. I mean, I wasn't on the league board at the time, but I've been told that we were involved in this. There were community groups that were really, you know, pressing the governor to engage more state resources in helping to make sure that the census went well. You know, that we were saying, hey, doing a census in the middle of a pandemic is going to be a hard situation, and it doesn't benefit the state of Florida if every citizen is not counted, if every resident is not counted, because we receive federal dollars on the basis of, you know, those counts, right? And my understanding is that, you know, as the governor, as the sitting governor at that time, that advocates for the census and for really like putting a full like hearty effort into, you know, recruiting volunteers, recruiting groups to get involved, you know, that was not something that the governor's office was willing or interested in doing.
Right.
And so to now be in this position of like, oh, well, you know, it was undercounted. It's like, well, whose fault is that really? You know, but that being said, like we still want the count to be accurate because again, resources come down to the state based on that, you know. So I believe that his sense is that it was undercounted, that more recent kind of interim population counts have shown an increased Florida population. Um, but you know, sometimes people are trying to talk out of both sides of their mouths because at the exact same time that folks are arguing for, you know, Florida to have more population and more congressional power, there are also Republican states that are saying that, you know, the census needs to explicitly exclude non-citizen residents, and that, you know, non-citizen residents shouldn't be accounted for in congressional district drawing or, right? So like, if we want to be our full-throated like Florida power, we should have every single resident counted and as much federal money and as much population as possible. But then, oh, but we can't count these people over here. So, you know, I think it's a little complicated and gets into, you know, some, I don't know, I don't know, like the motives of who's speaking at any given time. But yeah, that's my understanding is that there have been more recent population counts that are not as comprehensive as the census, but that have shown Florida to have perhaps a higher population than is shown in the 2020 census. But I also think that we, as a state, needed to do a better job of getting people to respond to the census forms. You know, like that's a real undertaking to get people to do, or to get people to answer the door when a census taker, you know, shows up at your door. And if you're kind of pushing mis and disinformation at that time about the Fed or, you know, all these things, then folks are going to be unwilling to respond to the census.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Okay, John has a question?
Well, it's not a question. Billy knows me because I've been attending meetings of the Manatee County League for 2 years. But I'm in California and we had our vote. And so I want to make 2 points. First, before I forget it, at the end of what you just said, you know, the reason the Constitution is set up the way it was is so that states with slaves could be counted in the census. So it added to how many representatives they could get, but they had no voting rights. And they had no other rights, obviously, because they were property. But the point I want to make is from tax returns and various other things, both California and New York have lost population significantly, and Florida has gained it significantly since the last census. And so if there was a census done now, Florida would probably get 2 or 3 more congressional districts, and California and New York both would lose at least 2 congressional districts. So the trend is that people are moving to Florida and Texas in particular from California and New York, and that will be reflected in the 2030 census no matter what happens between now and then. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, John.
The presentation was exquisite. I learned a lot. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Okay, Nancy has a question about the impact of increased voter turnout and what could that do for the redistricting, especially considering that 1/3 of our voters are non-party affiliated.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, NPAs are obviously a growing slice of the Florida electorate. I think we're up to about 3.5 million voters in Florida are registered as NPA. So, you know, I hope that at some point it's much, much harder for legislators to do partisan gerrymandering because people's voter behavior is not as entrenched, right? And you can't necessarily tell based on someone's zip code or party affiliation who they're going to vote for. So you know, I don't necessarily think that you know, you can quote outvote bad maps because what ends up happening is that you get a lot more extremism. Like when you have gerrymandered maps, you have, you know, the political primary of any given party is what kind of drives representation in that district. And so if you have a district that is, you know, a 10 plus Cook score, the Cook score is like how partisan is that map, right? So if something is 10 or more, that means that like in an average election, one party is going to do 10% better, you know, not just 10, but 10 points better than the other party. And so even in like a quote wave year, you know, the party in that district that's like the minority party, they might get 6 points better than they've ever gotten, which shows that voters are really angry. Like they are like really, and then that they still lose that district by 4 points, right? So like if something is a, you know, a 0 or a 1 or a 2 Cook score, well then, you know, voter will really has the ability to like move things one way or the other, right? I mean, voters often like will switch parties if they're unhappy with what's going on, and that's what they should be able to do because that is what democracy allows, right? Like we want people to be able to do that. So what happens in these like 10 plus like deep red or deep blue districts is that it's not so much what happens in the general election, it's what happens in the primary election. And in the primary election, this like small sliver of the electorate that's really, you know, kind of activated either on the left or on the right comes out and they pick someone who represents, you know, kind of their more or less like narrow values. And then that person, if they are in a red district, is probably, you know, the Republican candidate is gonna likely prevail in the general, even if that person's kind of out of the mainstream. Like that's how you end up with candidates who are really not willing to compromise, not really representative of, you know, the district as a whole, because, you know, they're really catering to that, you know, primary electorate. And then the same on the, you know, the same on the left. You get folks who are, you know, much more extreme and much less willing to compromise, and less practical than I think the average voter would want. So yeah, I don't think you can necessarily outvote like a bad map. I mean, in theory you could, but it would have to be like a huge sea change. And you know, it shouldn't require that. Because also if you had a fair general election map, hopefully the political party that put forward the candidate that was the most attractive election candidate would be the one, like, you know, at some point your primary electorate is going to wise up and go, hey, if we keep electing, you know, kooks to win the primary, they're not going to win the general. So like at some point, if you have fairer districts, the primary electorate also kind of figures that out, and they begin to put forward someone who is more likely to prevail in the general, which means someone who's more appealing to the average voter. And I, for one, would find that very welcome.
Well, that's also where open primaries come in, since so many of the races are determined in the primary anyhow. So,
Correct. Yes,
yeah.
absolutely.
Okay.
Or ranked choice or these other voting
Right.
methods that are very, yeah, would ultimately result in someone
Better
maybe
outcomes.
more
Yeah.
moderate or at least more appealing to a broader segment of the electorate. Yeah.
Mhm. All right. Any other questions? I don't see anything else in the chat. I don't see any hands raised. Anything else? All right. Well, thank you, Jessica. That was a very thorough and compelling presentation, so we appreciate you being with us. We'll ask our viewers, please take action on what you've learned and contact your elected officials about your concern. This call has been recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel if you'd like to share it with other people. So thank you so much to Jessica and our viewers for joining us tonight. Good night.
Everyone.
That was lovely. Very informative.
I'm so happy to see folks on this call.
Thanks so much, Jessica. We appreciate it.
Bye, y'all. See you soon.
Okay.